The final bank statement of the first black female star to sell out Las Vegas recorded a balance of exactly $2.14. Before dropping dead from an overdose in loneliness, Dorothy Dandridge was paid record fees to entertain VIP guests, but was forced by the casino to ride the garbage elevator and threatened with having the pool drained if she dared to touch the water. Having her will broken by racial humiliation, she used sedatives to anesthetize herself, creating the condition for her own legal husband to strip her of all accumulated assets. The entertainment industry drained the victim's talent, condoned financial violence, and nonchalantly discarded her the moment her profitability was exhausted. The United States of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s was not merely prejudiced, it was operating under a strict, legally codified, and violently enforced racial and economic caste system. In 1950, the structural economic disparity was staggering. While white American families had a median income of roughly $3,445, non-white families earned barely half of that, heavily restricted to the lowest paying sectors of the economy. More crucially, the racial wealth gap, the actual accumulation of assets, property, and capital, was astronomical. Black Americans, despite comprising roughly 10% of the national population at the time, held less than 2% of the nation's total wealth. Hollywood and the burgeoning casino industry were the ultimate gatekeepers of this wealth. They were not run by sensitive artists or progressive thinkers. They were run by ruthless businessmen, elite studio moguls, and, in the case of early Las Vegas, highly organized crime syndicates. These men understood human capital with terrifying clarity. They intimately understood the leverage they possessed over a black woman operating in a society where she had absolutely no structural, legal, or institutional safety net to fall back on. Dorothy Dandridge was psychologically and biologically primed for complete corporate exploitation long before she ever set foot in the scorching Nevada desert or the sound stages of Hollywood. Born in Cleveland, Ohio in 1922, her early life was entirely devoid of the standard protections of childhood. Her existence was rigidly, completely dictated by her ambitious mother, Ruby Dandridge, and her mother's partner, Geneva Williams. Geneva was a remarkably strict, deeply authoritarian disciplinarian who actively managed Dorothy and her sister Vivian as a grueling, traveling vaudeville act known as the Wonder Children. During the height of the Great Depression, while other children were attending school and developing vital social skills, Dorothy was forced onto the grueling, unforgiving Chitlin circuit, a network of segregated venues across the Jim Crow South and the Midwest. Geneva did not nurture Dorothy as a developing human being. She drilled her as a commercial asset. The childhood Dorothy experienced was entirely devoid of physical safety, emotional sanctuary, or basic bodily autonomy. Under the threat of physical punishment, she was taught from an incredibly tender age that her intrinsic human value was conditionally tied to her ability to flawlessly perform. She was forced to manufacture a radiant smile on command and, most importantly, to consistently generate vital income for the adults who legally and physically controlled her. This early, highly toxic environment of conditional love and harsh discipline laid the permanent psychological groundwork for her future. It completely normalized the terrifying concept that authority figures were inherently entitled to abuse, exploit, and extract from her. She was systematically trained to suppress her own physical exhaustion, her emotional pain, and her personal boundaries to satisfy the financial demands of her managers. When the Hollywood studios and the Las Vegas casinos eventually applied the exact same mechanisms of conditional reward and psychological abuse decades later, her brain had already been hardwired to endure it without rebellion. The studios did not have to break her spirit. Geneva Williams had already done the heavy lifting. When Dorothy finally transitioned to the massive, highly guarded gates of Hollywood in the 1940s and 1950s, the industry's racial boundaries were rigidly defined by the studio heads and the heavily racist dictates of the Hays Code. Statistically, black actors made up a microscopic fraction of speaking roles in major motion pictures. Furthermore, the roles they were strictly confined to were deeply humiliating subservient stereotypes, shuffling porters, comedic maids, or offensive, simple-minded caricatures explicitly designed to comfort white audiences. Dorothy flatly, dangerously refused these roles. She possessed a fierce, undeniably sharp intellect, a breathtaking physical beauty, and a singular, undeniable grace that simply could not be contained within a maid's uniform. She fought tooth and nail against a massive studio system designed to suppress her, actively risking her livelihood to break the mold. This agonizing, years-long battle ultimately culminated in her securing the starring titular role in Otto Preminger's 1954 all-black musical film, Carmen Jones. Her performance was electric. She scorched the screen with a complex, highly sensual, and powerful performance that demanded absolute respect. The subsequent Academy Award nomination for Best Actress was a massive, unprecedented watershed moment in American cultural history. It felt like the heavy iron doors of Hollywood had finally been kicked open. But here is the critical, devastating pivot in the mechanics of her exploitation. The wealthy white men who entirely controlled the entertainment capital of the world did not view her historic Oscar nomination as a profound breakthrough for civil rights, nor did they view her as an equal artistic peer deserving of fair compensation and respect. In their boardrooms, they viewed her nomination strictly, cynically, as a highly lucrative revenue guarantee. They immediately weaponized her new towering historical status against her. They recognized that she was now a premium, exoticized novelty. They used her prestige, her beauty, and her Oscar nomination as an intoxicating identity bait, specifically designed to stimulate the curiosity, the lust, and the deep-seated arrogance of the wealthy, white, male elite. They knew with cold mathematical certainty that these powerful men would pay exorbitant sums just to sit in a luxurious room with a black woman whose undeniable talent had commanded the respect of the Academy, but whose race still placed her firmly beneath them. She was the ultimate prize that they could temporarily purchase the illusion of owning. This dark calculation is exactly what brings us to the neon-lit desert of Nevada, to a city widely and accurately known at the time as the Mississippi of the West. As the intoxicating facade of Hollywood success temporarily concealed the deep conditioning of her abusive youth, the corporate machine recognized an unprecedented opportunity for extraction. Her historic Academy Award nomination for Carmen Jones was not the protective institutional shield she so desperately believed it to be. Instead, the studio bosses and casino syndicates weaponized it, utilizing her newly minted prestige as the ultimate bait to lure the wealthiest white elites into the most hostile, rigidly segregated environment in America. The fateful transition from the highly controlled silver screen to the neon-drenched desert of Nevada required a brutal architectural shift. It transformed her overnight from a universally celebrated actress into a captive, highly profitable commodity trapped within a maze meticulously designed to degrade her humanity. When the Las Vegas casino syndicates publicly offered Dorothy Dandridge a headline-making contract totaling $50,000 for a multi-week engagement, it immediately created a massive illusion of power and progress. To the marginalized black communities across America reading the magazine spreads, and to the mainstream press, this astronomical figure looked like the ultimate undeniable victory over systemic racism. It appeared as though the impenetrable walls of American segregation had finally been breached by the sheer force of her Academy Award-nominated talent. It functioned as the ultimate set of golden handcuffs, meticulously designed to blind the public and the performer to the reality of the transaction. However, critically examining the highly sophisticated, ruthless casino business model of the 1950s reveals that her weekly earnings of roughly $10,000 to $15,000 were heavily taxed and fractured. Before she even saw a dollar, large percentages were immediately extracted by her aggressive management team, booking agents, and the expensive logistics required to mount a world-class stage show. In the cold ledgers of the executives who controlled the Nevada desert, her massive payout was strictly classified as a customer acquisition cost. The sheer amount of money they deposited into her accounts was merely a microscopic fraction of the millions that wealthy white high rollers enthusiastically lost at the roulette wheels and the blackjack pits immediately after watching her perform. The Vegas syndicates absolutely did not pay Dorothy Dandridge for her brilliant acting or her exquisite vocal phrasing. They paid purely and entirely for her submission. That massive sum of money was specifically allocated to buy her complete silence, her forced compliance, and her flawless endurance in the face of a brutal, systemic architecture specifically designed to humiliate her on a daily basis. The casino bosses, operating with the terrifying efficiency of organized crime, had meticulously calculated the human risks before she ever signed the contract. They intimately understood the crushing, suffocating psychological pressure of the fiercely segregated environment they were forcefully placing her in. They did not view her as a fragile human being who needed to be protected from racist abuse. They viewed her as a highly valuable piece of industrial machinery. Consequently, they literally programmed a human depreciation cycle into their corporate ledgers. They knew with absolute certainty that the unrelenting daily hostility of their own policies would eventually break her brilliant mind and shatter her nervous system. But instead of actively protecting their star asset, instead of altering their racist policies to preserve her health, they chose to run her biological engine at absolute maximum capacity until it completely seized up. They quietly prepared their financial exit strategies, ready to ruthlessly cut their losses and permanently liquidate the asset the exact moment she lost psychological control. In the grand timeline of American entertainment, Dorothy Dandridge was the beautiful sacrificial lamb utilized by the syndicates to meticulously perfect the machinery of corporate and racial exploitation for the next generation of performers. The highly coordinated systemic mechanism of this exploitation started with profound calculated spatial violence. In the glittering, deeply segregated world of 1950s Las Vegas, the brightly lit stage was the absolute only physical space where Dorothy Dandridge was officially permitted to shine. But we must never mistake that stage for a place of actual freedom or genuine artistic liberation. It was in reality a highly controlled extraction zone, the physical edge of the stage where the polished wood met the plush carpeting of the showroom floor served as a terrifying, invisible psychological electric fence. This strict architectural boundary ensured that the entirely white, affluent audience could safely consume her radiant image, her sexuality, and her iconic voice as a premium luxury good, entirely without her ever encroaching on their protected social space. They were permitted to look at her, to desire her, and to applaud her, but she was never, under any circumstances, permitted to exist alongside them as an equal human being. The precise moment the grand orchestra stopped playing and the heavy velvet curtain dropped, the intoxicating illusion of her stardom instantly evaporated, and the brutal reality of Jim Crow laws violently slammed into place. She was, without question, the highest paid, most famous entertainer in the entire building, yet she was strictly forbidden from casually walking through the carpeted main lobbies of the very casino that bore her name in massive neon letters. The white casino management forcefully mandated that she navigate exclusively through the hotel's dark, damp, and highly hazardous industrial underbelly. Following her triumphant performances, where she wore custom-designed haute couture gowns worth thousands of dollars, she was violently forced to use the hidden service entrances. She had to ride exclusively in the rattling freight elevators, completely crammed in alongside sweating maintenance workers, massive bins of rotting food scraps, and leaking garbage bags. Her exquisite gowns literally absorbed the rancid stench of the casino's kitchen waste as she was transported through the bowels of the building. This horrifying protocol was absolutely not a mere logistical oversight, nor was it a simple reflection of standard hotel policy. It was a calculated daily architectural assault explicitly engineered by the casino syndicates to physically equate her breathtaking presence with disposable garbage. It was a psychological weapon designed to completely destroy her inner pride, constantly reminding her that regardless of how many Academy Award nominations she received in their eyes, she would never be anything more than the help. Furthermore, the Las Vegas syndicates enacted a total suffocating blockade of all luxury spaces and basic human comforts. Despite the undeniable fact that she was single-handedly generating immense wealth for the hotel conglomerates, she was aggressively barred from renting or occupying their luxurious penthouse suites. While white performers of significantly lesser fame were routinely comped the most opulent accommodations the city had to offer, Dorothy Dandridge was forcibly exiled from the glittering strip. She was banished to the West Side, the heavily segregated, deeply impoverished slum on the dusty, unpaved outskirts of the city. She was forced to sleep in dilapidated black-owned boarding houses that often lacked reliable plumbing or adequate air conditioning to combat the suffocating Mojave Desert heat. She was forced to completely exhaust herself on a world-class stage, only to retreat to a dusty, isolated room that starkly contrasted with the staggering wealth she had just created. Beyond the freight elevators and isolated boarding houses, the daily physical policing extended to basic bodily functions. If she needed to use a restroom during a grueling rehearsal at venues like the Thunderbird or El Rancho Vegas, she was strictly forbidden from using the polished indoor facilities. She was forced to walk outside, often in the blistering desert heat, to use poorly maintained, segregated outdoor toilets reserved for black maintenance staff. The physical demands of her contract were equally punishing and designed without any regard for her physical limits. She was locked into a relentless schedule, forced to perform 2 to 3 grueling shows a night, 7 days a week, often wrapping up her final set at 3 in the morning. The casino showrooms were notoriously unventilated and consistently thick with heavy cigar and cigarette smoke. This toxic atmosphere actively stripped the protective coating from her vocal cords night after night, accelerating her physical decline. Furthermore, between these exhausting performances, she was frequently denied access to a proper backstage dressing room where she could safely rest. In venues where her presence was heavily restricted, she had to wait out her breaks standing in the sweltering, grease-filled casino kitchens. She was constantly surrounded by sweating cooks and heavily armed mafia enforcers who monitored her every move to ensure she did not wander into white-only areas. Out on the showroom floor, the abuse continued directly from the audience. Drunken high rollers would frequently shout blatant racial slurs and derogatory commands from the front rows while she sang. Because the mob syndicates controlled the venues, she possessed absolutely no right to stop the music, confront the hecklers, or defend herself in any capacity. She was contractually obligated to maintain a radiant smile, singing flawlessly through the direct verbal assault to protect the casino's highly lucrative alcohol sales. If she asked for a simple glass of water to soothe her burning throat during a set, the casino staff routinely refused to serve her in standard glassware, forcing her to drink out of flimsy paper cups to prevent her lips from contaminating the venue's dishes. The behavioral mandates imposed upon her were equally suffocating and strictly monitored by casino management. If she was ever permitted to briefly cross the casino floor for mandatory publicity photos, she was given direct, non-negotiable orders regarding her physical conduct. She was explicitly instructed never to initiate conversation with a white guest and to immediately avert her gaze if approached by a high roller. This intense surveillance made her personal life terrifyingly dangerous within the state limits. During her Las Vegas residencies, her highly publicized secret romantic relationship with white director Otto Preminger carried severe literal legal risks. Nevada strictly enforced anti-miscegenation laws at the time, meaning any public display of their relationship was not merely a tabloid scandal, but a criminal offense that could have resulted in her immediate arrest. The absolute cruelty of this spatial violence extended directly to her basic biological needs. She was legally forbidden from eating a meal or ordering a drink in the very same high-end restaurants where her name was currently headlining the marquee. If she wanted to eat between her grueling shows, she had to consume her meals in a cramped dressing room or eat out of a paper bag in the back of a segregated taxi cab. This was not just physical segregation. This was profound, deliberate psychological starvation. It was a constant, inescapable reminder that she was merely a profitable tool, forever marginalized and violently excluded from the high society and the immense financial prosperity that her own talent actively financed. She was a reigning queen, completely stripped of her kingdom the moment she stepped out of the spotlight. The daily systemic hostility deployed against Dorothy Dandridge rapidly escalated from mere spatial isolation to outright acts of biological warfare. The most infamous, psychologically devastating example of this systemic cruelty occurred at the luxurious Hotel Last Frontier. During a particularly grueling run of high-pressure shows in the searing heat of the Nevada desert, Dorothy sought a brief, innocent moment of physical relief. She walked out to the edge of the hotel's massive, pristine, and entirely segregated swimming pool, took off her shoes, and simply dipped her bare toe into the cool water. The immediate reaction from the white casino management was not just angry or legally discriminatory. It was terrifyingly psychotic. The hotel executives immediately swarmed the area, aggressively confronting her and loudly threatening to entirely drain thousands of gallons of water from the massive pool. Furthermore, they promised to bring in maintenance crews to forcefully scrub the entire concrete basin with harsh industrial chemicals and acid if she ever dared to physically touch the water again. We must pause and look critically at what this horrific specific threat actually meant within the context of 1950s American racism. The Las Vegas syndicates literally weaponized water against her. They actively utilized the swimming pool as a chemical solvent to completely isolate, degrade, and dehumanize her on a molecular level. This incredibly violent public attack assigned her beautiful body a terrifying, deeply racist status of ontological impurity. It sent a clear, universally understood message. Her very biological existence, the melanin in her skin, was viewed by the establishment not as human, but as an infectious disease that actively threatened the delicate social supremacy of the white patrons. The loud public threat to use harsh industrial chemicals to erase the microscopic trace of her physical presence was nothing less than a public execution of her fundamental human dignity. It was a terrifying cleansing ritual forced upon her in broad daylight, meticulously designed to make her internalize a profound sense of deep self-disgust. The agonizing dissonance between this backstage reality and her onstage repertoire was staggering. Night after night, she was contractually obligated to step into the spotlight and perform upbeat, joyful standards to the exact same crowds that enforced her degradation. She had to project a flawless image of carefree, effervescent luxury, forcefully swallowing her rage and smiling on cue simply to survive her shift. The daily transition from the adored center of attention to an unwanted outcast exacted a severe toll. At night, audiences paid premium prices to watch her perform in opulent showrooms. Yet the moment the sun rose, she navigated hotel policies that treated her presence as a contamination threat, forcing herself to project an aura of effortless glamour while constantly suppressing the reality of daytime segregation systematically fractured her mental well-being. The sheer volume of emotional labor strictly required to survive this agonizing, hourly whiplashy pee permanently shattered her delicate central nervous system. This unrelenting architectural assault and profound spatial violence did not merely exhaust her physical body. It overloaded her brain's capacity to process systemic trauma. Trapped in this inescapable psychological paradox, her central nervous system inevitably reached a complete breaking point. To survive this agony without officially suffering a total mental collapse on the casino's expensive time, she was pushed toward the only corporate-sanctioned emergency exit available. She developed a severe reliance on synthetic chemical sedation. During her demanding years on the Vegas stages and Hollywood sets, heavy doses of amphetamines and barbiturates were utilized as functional tools to maintain her punishing schedule while enduring daily racial hostility. Mainstream Hollywood history often lazily and maliciously frames her escalating reliance on heavy prescription drugs as a simple personal failing or a tragic lack of moral fortitude. This heavily sanitized victim-blaming narrative is entirely factually incorrect. We must radically reframe our view of her addiction. In the brutally hostile, violently segregated environment she was forced to navigate without a single shred of institutional protection, continuous chemical sedation was not a recreational choice. It was a strictly compulsory biological defense mechanism. She was existing in a perpetual state of hypervigilance, constantly bracing for the next locked door or the next threat of industrial chemicals, while simultaneously being contractually mandated to project radiant joy to the very men who enforce those rules. This impossible, suffocating duality overloaded her brain's ability to process trauma. The heavy synthetic pharmaceuticals she consumed acted as the only emergency circuit breaker she had to temporarily paralyze a fragile nervous system that was actively screaming from continuous psychological abuse. The elite underground entertainment industry and the casino syndicates did not just passively tolerate this rampant drug use among their black performers. They actively and quietly encouraged it. To the ruthless men running the ledgers, the pills and the liquor were not a medical crisis. They were the absolute necessary, functional industrial lubricant that successfully kept their exhausted human machinery operating smoothly. It kept them generating millions of dollars without staging a strike or suffering a show-stopping breakdown on their expensive time. However, the profound biological tragedy of utilizing unregulated synthetic chemicals as a primary shield against systemic racism is that these narcotics exact a terrifying compounding toll on the human brain's cognitive architecture. The massive doses of barbiturates required to forcibly shut down her racing mind at night, followed by the massive doses of amphetamines required to forcefully restart her exhausted heart the next evening, severely depressed the executive functions of her prefrontal cortex. This specific region of the brain is fundamentally responsible for critical thinking, complex decision-making, and assessing long-term danger. By chemically attacking this region, the early narcotics severely compromised her nervous system, inducing a highly vulnerable state of extreme cognitive fatigue and profound financial blindness. As the years of the Las Vegas residencies ground on, the heavy pharmaceutical fog systematically eroded her usually sharp, logical reasoning and her innate ability to detect the incredibly dangerous predators hungrily circling her massive wealth. She was completely isolated by the racist policies of the casinos, entirely cut off from a genuine protective community, deeply exhausted from biologically impossible performance schedules, and heavily medicated simply to survive. The unyielding corporate machinery of 1950s America had methodically broken down every single one of her natural psychological defenses. She was no longer just a highly profitable entertainer. She had been chemically reduced to an unguarded vault of liquid cash, sitting exposed in the middle of the desert. The stage was now tragically set, and she was meticulously primed for the absolute worst kind of human vultures, who were simply waiting patiently in the shadows for the drugs to take their full blinding effect. Enter Jack Dennison. To the outside world and the glossy pages of the Hollywood tabloids, he appeared to be her handsome, charming second husband, a sophisticated nightclub owner, stepping in to sweep the beautiful star off her feet and provide her with the loving sanctuary she deserved. The reality was a deeply sociopathic inversion of that romantic narrative. Jack Dennison was a highly skilled opportunist. He targeted her during a period of deep psychological vulnerability, effectively isolating her from her remaining trusted advisors and family members. Positioning himself as her sole manager and protector, Dennison executed a textbook campaign of financial manipulation. He leveraged her cognitive fatigue to secure sweeping powers of attorney and access to her hard-earned accounts. He brilliantly played the role of a fierce, loving shield against a hostile white world, all while he was actively dismantling the very last of her financial and legal defenses entirely from the inside out. He convinced her that her trusted friends and former advisors were the ones trying to steal from her, successfully transferring all of her trust exclusively onto his shoulders. Having successfully captured the asset, Dennison ruthlessly weaponized the complex legal documents of the American financial system against the woman he claimed to love. Taking full advantage of her heavily medicated state and her manufactured reliance on him, he began pushing massive stacks of dense, impenetrable legal papers in front of her to blindly sign. These were sweeping, irrevocable powers of attorney, high-interest loan guarantees utilizing her name as the sole collateral, and countless blank checks drawing directly from her hard-earned personal accounts. Instead of paying off mafia gambling debts, Dennison aggressively funneled her massive fortune into a series of doomed, highly speculative restaurant ventures operating under his own name. He utilized her liquid capital and her credit to prop up his failing businesses, actively bleeding her accounts dry while she exhausted herself on the demanding nightclub circuit to generate more cash. The immense wealth generated from the fiercely segregated Las Vegas casinos flowed seamlessly into the pockets of her husband, and Dorothy was systematically bypassed in the transaction. She was completely reduced to the status of an unpaid, heavily medicated laborer in the very center of her own life. She was physically working herself into an early grave, actively destroying her vocal cords and her sanity, while Dennison operated as a flawless parasite, quietly draining her multi-million-dollar bank accounts entirely dry without ever having to step onto a stage or face a single racist insult. By the early dawn of the 1960s, the brutal performance schedule demanded by the casinos and the profound psychological torment finally began to physically manifest. The human body, no matter how beautiful or resilient, simply cannot sustain that level of compounding abuse indefinitely. Her legendary, captivating voice, once a smooth instrument of unparalleled grace, began to tragically lose its sharp edge and its breathtaking range. Her radiant, magnetic physical energy, which had previously commanded the absolute attention of the Academy, began to noticeably dim under the heavy weight of the barbiturates and the crushing reality of her financial theft. The cold, watchful Las Vegas machine immediately noticed the slight depreciation in the asset. The powerful men sitting in the boardrooms did not view her physical decline as a tragic medical emergency requiring intervention, rest, or compassion. They viewed it strictly as a breach of their investment. The decision to terminate her contracts was swift and strictly mathematical. Once her physical exhaustion began to visibly impact ticket sales, the syndicates severed all professional ties without offering medical support, severance pay, or any acknowledgement of the millions she had previously generated for their properties. The lucrative weekly checks eventually stopped clearing the moment her ticket sales dipped, and the incredibly fragile illusion of her Las Vegas power was instantly shattered. It left her entirely exposed to the financial predators who were eagerly waiting for the casino to drop her. With her natural psychological defenses completely dissolved by the heavy daily doses of barbiturates, and her trusted inner circle actively orchestrating her isolation, the final phase of the corporate extraction could be seamlessly executed in the shadows. The systemic theft of her hard-earned fortune abruptly transitioned from the intimate manipulation of a predatory husband directly into the cold, ruthless machinery of elite white-collar corporate finance. This flawlessly orchestrated transition set the terrible stage for the ultimate crushing blow, where the towering institutions of the American government and the banking sector would coldly sweep in to permanently liquidate the last remaining fragments of her shattered existence. Seeing the massive river of Las Vegas cash violently dry up, a vicious flock of so-called wealth managers and trusted investment advisors hungrily circled her vulnerable, deeply panicked state. These men wore tailored suits, carried expensive briefcases, and operated with the full backing of the American corporate financial system. They expertly preyed entirely on her profound drug-induced cognitive fatigue and her terrifying panic over the sudden loss of her primary income. Recognizing that she was structurally cut off from any genuine ethical financial advocacy, they meticulously constructed a highly sophisticated legal maze, specifically designed to permanently separate her from the very last of her liquid capital. These elite white-collar predators aggressively convinced a deeply traumatized Dorothy Dandridge to blindly invest the last of her remaining cash reserves into a series of highly complex, incredibly opaque, independent oil ventures and speculative real estate developments. These were elaborate shell companies entirely designed to siphon her wealth into their own offshore accounts. The funds effectively vanished within a labyrinth of offshore accounts and opaque ledger entries. Through a coordinated strategy disguised as standard investment risk, her advisors successfully drained her remaining safety net. Because these transactions were sealed with formal banking procedures and notarized paperwork, the perpetrators faced no legal repercussions, leaving her to shoulder the entire financial collapse alone. The final, completely unsurvivable strike was the overwhelming institutional violence enacted directly by the federal government and the deeply racist, unforgiving American banking sector. Saddled entirely with the catastrophic debts fraudulently guaranteed by Jack Dennison and thoroughly wiped out by the fake white-collar oil investments, the Internal Revenue Service and the major banking institutions moved in. The banking institutions and the IRS moved to liquidate her assets with standard, unfeeling bureaucratic efficiency. Facing massive tax liens and the catastrophic debts left behind by Dennison, she was forcefully pushed into bankruptcy. She was not immediately thrown onto the street. Instead, she endured a slow, humiliating process of systemic financial degradation. To satisfy the crushing institutional debt, she was forced to sell her sprawling Hollywood Hills mansion, dismantling the only physical sanctuary where she had truly felt safe from the suffocating daily degradation of Jim Crow laws. This forced sale initiated a rapid downward mobility. She was systematically downgraded from a premier estate into a series of increasingly smaller, cheaper residences. Ultimately, the woman who had generated millions for the American entertainment industry was reduced to living in a modest, unglamorous apartment in West Hollywood, desperately taking low-paying gigs at obscure dive bars on the dusty, forgotten outskirts of town just to afford basic necessities. She was forced to endure the humiliating mockery of drunken patrons, heavily medicating herself just to summon the courage to step onto these pathetic stages, desperately trying to scrape together enough crumpled dollar bills to simply buy groceries and the heavy medication required to keep her failing heart beating. The absolute cruelty of this vertical fall from the Oscars to the dive bars was not an accident. It was the intended, highly efficient function of a system that violently punished black excellence the exact moment it could no longer be profitably controlled. When analyzing the horrific, entirely manufactured destruction of Dorothy Dandridge, There is a stubborn, insidious argument often found in the sanitized mainstream biographies of fallen historical stars. It is the deeply flawed, victim-blaming argument of personal complicity. Lazy critics, defensive industry historians, and an apathetic public often lean back and ask a series of deeply ignorant, historically blind questions. Why didn't she simply hire better lawyers to protect her wealth? Why didn't she physically leave Jack Dennison? Why did she blindly sign the complex legal papers without reading the fine print? We must entirely aggressively reject this deeply offensive victim-blaming narrative. It fundamentally ignores the terrifying, undeniable reality of absolute systemic exclusion in mid-century America. Dorothy Dandridge was absolutely not financially illiterate or legally naive by nature. She was intentionally, systematically, and legally kept entirely in the dark by a massive institutional system that actively barred black women from receiving genuine financial education, accessing ethical legal protection, or wielding any true institutional power. When the entire legal and financial framework of a country is meticulously designed from the ground up to entirely exclude you from participating in it, the casual advice of hiring a better lawyer is a literal historical impossibility. The elite lawyers, powerful bankers, studio executives, and wealth managers all belong to the exact same closed, deeply racist, and fiercely protected white male club. It was a club she was strictly and legally forbidden from ever entering, except as a highly paid temporary evening entertainment. Her devastating, highly public downfall was absolutely not a tragic series of unfortunate, misguided personal choices made by a weak woman. It was the highly predictable, mathematically calculated result of a society that aggressively refused to view her as a full, equal citizen possessing fundamental human rights. They viewed her exclusively as a highly profitable commercial commodity with a rapidly approaching expiration date. The multi-billion-dollar system did not fail Dorothy Dandridge. The system worked exactly and flawlessly as it was historically designed to work. It extracted the value, enriched the white gatekeepers, and successfully liquidated the asset when it was entirely empty. Why does the agonizing, historically buried destruction of Dorothy Dandridge urgently matter to us today? Because the highly sophisticated, ruthless corporate blueprint that was meticulously engineered and perfected to systematically dismantle her life is entirely, undeniably still in active, highly profitable use right now. Her horrifying story is not a distant relic of a bygone era. It is the direct historical precursor to modern, sanitized celebrity exploitation. When we critically look at the deeply restrictive conservatorships, easily imposed upon global pop stars today, or when we examine the predatory, inescapable 360-degree contracts blindly signed by desperate young artists in the modern music industry, we are looking directly at the evolved, legally fortified descendants of Dorothy Dandridge's brutal Las Vegas and Hollywood contracts. The underlying mechanism of corporate extraction remains chillingly the same, even if the PR language has been aggressively softened. Completely isolate the highly valuable talent from genuine support systems, meticulously control their physical environment and their daily schedule, systematically break down their natural psychological defenses through sheer exhaustion and cognitive dissonance, and utilize highly complex, deeply buried legal clauses to permanently separate them from the massive generational wealth they actively generate. Dorothy Dandridge's agonizing life stands today as a stark, urgently flashing warning light about the inherently predatory nature of the global entertainment industry when it operates without ethical boundaries or basic human empathy. Her survival and subsequent destruction force us, as the modern consuming public, to pause and ask a deeply uncomfortable, highly necessary question. What is the actual devastating human cost, the literal blood and sanity, embedded deeply within the media and the music we continuously, casually consume on a daily basis? The tragic final chapter of Dorothy Dandridge's extraordinary life was absolutely not a sudden or unforeseeable event. It was the mathematically inevitable conclusion of a long, drawn-out process of total systemic human extraction. By the early 1960s, the brutal reality of her complete financial ruin and the total collapse of her career fundamentally altered her medical trajectory. As the lucrative contracts vanished and her Hollywood mansion was lost, the chemical dependency shifted from performance-enhancing stimulants to heavy prescription medication aimed at numbing a profound psychological collapse. She sank into a severe clinical depression, completely stripped of her former glory and struggling to survive in a harsh reality. It was this specific, devastating mental health crisis that led to the heavy prescription of imipramine, setting the precise biological stage for her final moments. When she was tragically found dead, lying alone on the floor of a small, unglamorous West Hollywood apartment on September 8, 1965, the local coroner clinically listed the official cause of death as a severe, acute overdose of heavy synthetic antidepressants. But that sterile medical terminology is merely the biological chemical mechanism of her passing. The profound, undeniable historical truth is that she died because every single microscopic ounce of her physical, emotional, and financial life force had been aggressively, systematically mined by the American entertainment complex until there was absolutely nothing left to take. She was completely cornered by American history. Her unparalleled generational talent was violently wrung out by the massive studio monopolies. Her delicate psychological stability and her central nervous system were permanently shattered by the daily indignities of Jim Crow segregation and spatial violence. Her deep inherent human capacity for trust and love was ruthlessly weaponized and betrayed by the financial predator she tragically married. Her massive physical assets, her real estate, and her liquid capital were cleanly plundered by elite white-collar financial institutions and government tax agencies. Her fundamental human dignity was entirely trampled and discarded by a voracious consuming public that aggressively demanded her flawless performance, but violently denied her basic humanity. And then there is the final ultimate accounting. The $2.14 left completely alone in her frozen bank account. That microscopic number is profoundly, devastatingly haunting. It is not merely a sad, poetic symbol of an artistic tragedy. It is cold, hard forensic data. It is the ultimate, terrifying, and mathematically perfect proof that the towering machinery of mid-century corporate and racial exploitation operated flawlessly. It efficiently digested her vibrant youth. It totally absorbed her historical brilliance. It transferred her immense wealth directly to the men in power, and it cleanly left her with exactly nothing. Dorothy Dandridge was a true, unparalleled pioneer of unmatched grace, fierce intellect, and staggering resilience. She forcefully, bravely pushed open heavy ironclad doors that had been welded shut for centuries by systemic racism. But as we rightfully honor her towering cultural legacy today, we must absolutely never look away from the agonizing, fatal price she was forcefully mandated to pay for that progress. She was an undeniable queen who was violently forced to walk through the literal and metaphorical garbage of America, and she paid for our enduring entertainment completely with her life.